Right, Scott's dealing with a few permissions issues. He'll be right back. I'll talk in the interim. That's not a problem for me. Years ago, we were doing assessments in a static way. So, the conventional way, which was to either come in as a service or delivery team, help the organization benchmark themselves on a known standard, something like DFARS or CMMC, ISO, and then the CSF came out. So we were doing some quick assessments around the CSF. But it was always understood that there was an opportunity to take the data that existed in applications and get it into controls directly. So, formerly we would have the meetings with IT, with compliance, with the risk teams, collect data, and then populate controls that way. It was very time intensive. And the vision was really to start getting the telemetry directly onto the controls. A lot of security products have understood this and now provide, alongside their products, mappings into, say, 853 or other control frameworks. But it's often not leveraged. It's it's because there's some work involved. So beginning last year, we sort of exited the R&D phase, which was to take as much telemetry as possible, map it to controls, and then roll it into risk. And we started to actually take data in directly from products through APIs and onto controls. This, speeds the assessment process. It also has another set of interesting effects, which is it makes any risk assessment that is related to controls or security control groupings much more dynamic and in real time. So instead of risk assessments being done on old data, they're now done on data that is updating, as frequently as on the hour. This makes cyber decisioning a lot more effective, a lot more accurate, and most of the large concerns in the world in cyber and in risk are, going great guns for this at the moment, and we're a part of that. So just checking on Scott here. One moment. Scott's back, but does he have screen permission is the question.
Patty, I might need you to share your screen. I'm not sure what's going on here.
Let me grab the presentation. I'll be right back. All right. Let's see if I can grab this here. Entire screen, share, and get rid of the infinite regress. Okay. This might not have everything in it, Scott, because I think I missed your bio. It's just a brief touch upon who we are. We've already done that, and I will get to the first slide here, Scott. And
awesome, thanks. So sorry about that technical difficulty there. So really, when it comes to continuous control automation, it's spending less time evaluating the current state of controls and more time improving security. So taking the time that you were going to be spending to check the current state of a particular control and having that automatically done for you in a continuous way. And then being able to take that time savings, that cost savings, and move that into actual solutions that are going to help your overall organization improve their security, and really start delivering solutions and overall security improvements instead of just kind of spinning your wheels and always checking on the current state of things. So for this particular talk, just going to go into some of the technical ways that we're looking at continuous control automation. So that's going to be looking at a lot of JSON responses, some SQL queries, and getting into some of the technical details and things that we think about when we're going to automate a particular control or a compliance data point for a particular control. So there's three main ways that we're doing that right now, and it's application built-in policies, API response inspection, and then data warehouses. So I think we're going to start here with the policy one. So Pat, if you go to the next slide. So in this example, we're looking at a Azure policy. So in Azure, we have a section called policies where you can see that they've list a list of built-in policies that will evaluate the infrastructure that's deployed onto Azure continuously. So in this case, it's just that subscriptions should all have a contact email for security issues. So this is run against every subscription in your Azure environment, continuously evaluating. So if there's ever a subscription created that doesn't have a contact email address, this would get flagged as not compliant. And this case, or in this case, it's IR4 incident handling. So there's multiple policies that relate back to kind of IR4 within Azure, and then overall in a kind of a security program. So this is just one small piece to that overall control and overall compliance program. So if you go to the next slide, Patty, we'll see this is one of the response JSONs that we use to evaluate that policy on Azure. So when we do that integration or that automation with Azure, this is the data that we're actually pulling in and evaluating, and then pulling that data over into a control or a part of a control as a kind of a compliance data point for that overall control. So in this case, you can see that we have some JSON values here, and the ones we'd key off in this specific example is the is compliant. So we can see here that it's false with a compliance state of not compliant. So we know that that particular policy for Azure has not been is not compliant for this specific subscription. So a lot of the cloud services are doing this, or a lot of applications in general are starting to do this, where they have their own siloed way, or they know how to deal with some control data so that they make that available to users or customers in their environments. But it's only really a small piece of the overall kind of compliance and security puzzle. So fitting all that together is sort of where overall continuous control monitoring is going to bring us. Taking a piece from Azure, taking a piece from AWS, taking a piece from GitHub, taking all those little pieces and combining them into an overall control to get kind of the full picture of your compliance posture, and do that in a continuous automated way. So if you go to the next slide, Patty. So in this case, we're starting to look at some of the API response inspection. So we're looking at the control IA2, so identification and authentication, control enhancement 1. And this is around having multi-factor enabled for applications. So if we were looking at specifically a GitHub application, and we wanted to automate, that part of the control, and we wanted to verify that GitHub had all of its users enabled with two-factor, we'd first look at the API and figure out how we can get that data. So at initial glance, it looks like we can't get that data because the response is not returning us any attribute with two-factor enabled. So if you look over to the right using their REST API, there's nothing in that response that's going to tell us whether or not that particular member has two-factor enabled. But if we look a little further, and if you go to the next slide, we can see that GitHub does offer a query parameter for their REST API that will allow us to get that data. So in the URL, which is that last part of this specific curl command, we can see HTTPS api.github.com. We have !filter equals 2FA_disabled. So now we've changed that members REST API call from returning all of the member data to just returning member data users that don't have two-factor enabled. So the compliance data point that we would use for GitHub would be verifying that the length of this particular response is empty. We know that if we see any users in the response from this REST call, that they don't have two-factor enabled, and that could be a failing compliance data point. So it's a little bit different from the previous example where we were seeing just a true false in a REST JSON response that we could key off of to drive that compliance data point. And then if we go to the next slide, Patty. This is another example, kind of another way of thinking about parsing a particular API response. So in this example, we're looking at the RA5 control, so vulnerability scanning, and particularly vulnerability scanning happening at some sort of interval. So if we're using the Tenable service and we know that we want to find a completed scan every 7 days or 10 days or whatever the particular organization's policy has been set up to set to, then we could parse this particular API response and look for all of the statuses, all the scans with statuses complete. And the first time we find that, we're going to look for that last modification date or that created date and make sure that that's within that window that we've set as an organization to fulfill this particular control. So we know if that's outside of that window, then that's a failing compliance data point. And if it's within that window, then we know that's a passing compliance data point. So really just driving home the way of looking at different APIs and how every vendor or application exposes things in a little bit of a different way. And we have to really look at how they're going to be able to send us that information and how we can use that information to drive compliance data points as they relate to specific controls. And it's not always kind of a black and white type of situation where we can always use an attribute and tie that in. It's a little more in depth of looking at the API, analyzing it, thinking about how it's going to relate to particular controls, and then creating those data points that way. Yep. Go to the next slide. So the last thing I wanted to talk about as it relates to continuous control automation is data warehouses. So in the previous examples, we've seen how you could go out to each individual application, use their APIs to get data back from that application, and do some sort of logic on the back end, some sort of business logic to calculate those compliance data points and relate them back to controls. I think the game changer here would be using some sort of data warehouse. So this works under the assumption that an organization is going to take all of their security related applications and data and pipe that into a common location, whether that's a Snowflake or a BigQuery, structured or unstructured, just somewhere where all of that data is going to live and that we can get access to it, or your organization get access to it, to then drive those compliance data points from that overall data warehouse instead of going to each individual application. So the big upside for the data warehouses is that you have one interface point for calculating your compliance data, as opposed to trying to do the authentication for all of the different applications. Every application is doing the REST authentication a different way, whether it's basic auth, OAuth, API tokens, etc. So you have to go through each individual application and set up that authentication. Whereas if it's all in one place, you're just setting up one connector to a data warehouse and driving all of the data from that one data warehouse. So if you go to the next slide here, Patty. So in this case, if we look at a control, AT2, control enhancement 3 around training data. So we want to verify that all of our users are getting phishing training, ransomware training, all the training that they need to be aware of security, cybersecurity, potential incidents. And instead of going to NGO ourselves and trying to have a API inspect the REST API of NGO, we can pipe that data over into our data warehouse, and now we have a table with all of our employees, and we could check that against all of the trainings that they should have completed against the table with all of the completed training. So as an organization, we can then set the threshold for the percentage of trainings that we want to either pass or fail as control. So whether that's setting something like a 80% completion rate is passing for this control, or just going all the way to a 100% completion rate to pass the control. But we have that kind of universal interface that we can use to create a query and grab that data from the data warehouse instead of trying to go to each individual application. Another good example would be if we had a tenable scans or a scans table here. We could do a select star from tenable scans where completed date is greater than or equal to, today minus 7 days. So again, instead of going into that tenable application, we are just querying the data warehouse. We have one central location where we can start deriving those compliance data points instead of trying to interface with all of the different applications that our organization has. So then if you go to the last slide, Patty. So here's a very simple diagram, just highlighting another point for the advantages of the continuous control automation. So in a traditional control review cycle, maybe we're reviewing a control once a quarter, maybe twice a year, once a year. So there's that big gap where we don't know the real state of that control. And in this case, we could see that maybe that control was compliant to start Q1, but 30 days into Q1, that control fell into not compliant. But we don't know that until Q2 comes along, and then we could evaluate that control as not compliant. But if we wanted to go back and see where that control fell out of compliance, we'd either have to go through logs, we'd have to go through different applications to figure out how and why that control fell out of compliance and exactly when that happened. So if we're making risk decisions based off of the compliance of a particular control, this is helpful information to have as we're making those decisions, maybe as it goes from Q2 to Q3. Our control was compliant to start Q1, but now it's no longer compliant, and it hasn't been compliant for 2/3 of the quarter. What sort of assumptions can we make about that control effectiveness as it relates to a particular risk? And maybe we just need to add or propose a solution to start measuring the variance of that particular control so that it doesn't fall out of compliance. But we have that data readily available. Now we know exactly when that control fell out of compliance, and we can take the necessary steps to remediate that. And then I think it goes over to Patty's slides here.
Yep. And I'm just going to wrap up, with a little big picture from the business side on what Scott said. It's been a journey, certainly automation, but the basic idea is that cyber teams have plenty of work to do. That in my daily conversations with organizations, that is the common theme. That there's more work than anyone can realistically do. And in order to practice security properly, you need to be forward-looking. You can't always be looking over your shoulder. Automation is not a strategy to replace labor inputs. It's really just to free up teams to do better what they want to do going forward. So with respect to risk management is now on a journey. I think, arguably many of the models that have been in play for benchmarking and baselining organizations on risk are now accepted well understood. They're becoming more and more widely adopted. But a lot of data just hangs out there and stagnates. That's an historical problem in cyber. So the only way to compete in the digital age is to transform cyber risk management along with the rest of the business. And how do you do that? Well, through automation. And it's long overdue in a sense in cyber, because there are many, many brilliant products in cyber, but the data doesn't always flow across the organization properly. It's not always standardized properly. It doesn't always roll up to risk. It's not well understood what application risk is, what more granular or higher fidelity risk is. These problems all can be solved with automation. And we've been working with companies for years on this. And I would say our most cutting edge organizations are really pushing us hard now to get higher fidelity data into risk models, and to have risk assessment be a live process, and to do it in ways that operations can understand, and also the board and the C-suite. So you really need to have translation layers in place. And it was fascinating watching Scott talk about that, because he was getting into the actual translation and the difference across different data sources, which is really the bread and butter of this. Over here, this is really just our big takeaway slide on automation. It really just sort of visualizes what Scott was going through. You have on the left a security stack. Even now, talking to organizations, not all of their data makes it across into audit and compliance, and then across into risk properly. It'll get stuck somewhere, or it gets looked at maybe quarterly, but it's not being looked at continuously. And risk management, if it's going to leap into the future, has to be done continuously. And Scott covered the API and the data lake approach there quite credibly. So I won't go into too much depth around this, and I think we've got enough time left over perhaps to open it up for some questions. So let me see if I can escape my screen here and get back to the actual screen. Stop sharing. All right. So we have the Q&A open now, and I'm looking at the Q&A panel here, and I don't see anything popping up as of yet, but I'll give you all a moment if you have any questions. Okay, I've notified that Q&A is now open.
So does the data lake aggregation method offer significant benefits over the use of individual APIs to access data? Yeah, I think so. I think if you're, as an organization, at a point where you can get security data all over into a data lake, then it's so much easier to interface with one spot, perform authentication against one application, and be able to start pulling out little bits and pieces of compliance data for particular controls. And you can also do it on a more ad hoc way. You don't have to look at those JSON responses every single time to figure out the overall compliance data. You can look at a control, pick out a piece of it, write a query to evaluate that, and kind of continue on the process. So I think that's a big step forward. I think it's going to be tough to. I think the big blocker there is getting all of that data into that data lake. But if you can do it, then I think that's going to be very, very powerful. So does this assess local resources or just cloud services? So the big thing that we need, or when we think about, is having some API into the data. A big obstacle that we find with even on-prem installations is it's all firewalled off. And when we start talking about poking holes in firewalls just to get compliance data, that's typically been a non-starter. That's not a good enough reason for companies to poke a hole in their firewalls. So I think that goes back to maybe the data lake kind of idea of, you can house that data or those applications behind a firewall and then push the data that you want to expose to other applications into something a little more public. So that's really the big thing. You need some sort of endpoint access, whether it's REST or XML or some sort of a way to get that data kind of over the fence, so that we can evaluate it. So I think maybe a good example would be Active Directory as it relates to Azure. So if I understand correctly, you can have an on-prem Active Directory that hooks up to the Azure cloud. So that would be kind of.
Any other questions, Scott? All right. I think we can wrap up there. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. I found it fascinating. So thank you, Scott, for all of that. And stay tuned for the next 2 days of the conference. Really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.